Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to speak in opposition to the pending nomination. I wanted to take this few minutes today to discuss the nomination of Ms. Samantha Powers to be the next U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Now, let me begin by saying Ms. Powers is an impressive person. She has an inspiring personal story. She's clearly very intelligent, and she's already accomplished much in her career. However, I do have three concerns that I wanted to take a moment to highlight today. The first, I got to tell you, has to do with concerns that I have about her unwillingness to directly answer questions that I personally posed to her during her confirmation hearing in the Senate during our Foreign Relations Committee. At that hearing, I asked her about statements attributed to her in the past alleging that the United States had committed crimes, quote unquote, that it needed to reckon with. I raised this question not to embarrass her, but rather to give her the opportunity to clarify by either pointing out examples of these crimes or to clarify what she meant by those comments. But instead, she kept avoiding directly addressing my question. She kept saying that America was the greatest country in the world and that she wouldn't apologize for America. I don't think it's unreasonable to be concerned about those statements, and I do not think it is unfair to be concerned about the fact that we are sending someone to represent us at the most important international forum in the world who thinks the United States has committed crimes that it needs to reckon with. I believe that I and the members of the committee deserved an answer to this question, but instead what we got in response was a rehearsed line. And I got to say, it was a missed opportunity for her and for all of us. And I want to say that for me, these statements that she made in the past and her inability to answer them or address them raise questions about her judgment. Although let me be clear, I certainly do not question her patriotism. But second, I have an even greater concern that she's being appointed by a president whose foreign policy is fast becoming an utter and absolute failure. From the crisis in the Middle East to strategic uncertainty in Asia to a country who we told was a partner but now is harboring a fugitive and a traitor who has done great damage to the U.S. national security, I believe the world is now more dangerous and more uncertain than when President Obama first took office. It's increasingly apparent that our foes are more willing than ever to challenge us. Even more troubling is that those who seek to emulate us, who desire the freedom that we all as Americans enjoy, are often left to fend for themselves with little American support. A strong, engaged America has been good for the world and for the American people. When America fails to lead, the result, as we see in Syria today, is chaos. A chaos that allows others with goals other than our own to fill the void we leave behind. History taught us twice in the last century that even if we put our head in the sand and try to ignore the world's problems, those problems will not ignore us. Now, I realize the American people are weary of war. We've paid a tremendous price in lives and money in the war on radical Islamic terrorism. But to follow the advice of those, including some in the Republican Party, who advocate disengagement from the world would be a terrible mistake. If we follow their advice, we will only pay a higher price in the long term. Now, let me be clear, that does not mean that America can solve every problem or get engaged in every civil war on the planet. I would confess we also have voices here that are too eager to engage America in every conflict on the planet. We need to be very careful about when, where, and how we engage American forces overseas. But isolationism on the one hand and hyper-intervention on the other are not our only two options. Between these two choices, we have a third option, and it is this. One based on the idea that while the United States cannot solve every problem in the world, there are very few problems in the world that cannot be solved without the United States. If a problem can be solved by using an international forum like the United Nations, that's fine. But more often than not, the UN can't and won't confront the problem. In the end, the truth is that America is still the only nation in the world able to form and lead coalitions to confront evil and solve problems. It is still the only nation on earth able to keep the seas open for trade. It is still the only nation capable of maintaining the safe balance of power in Asia and Europe and around the world. It is still the only nation on earth capable of preventing rogue nations from becoming nuclear powers. And it is still the only nation on earth capable of targeting and diminishing radical terrorist organizations who plot to attack and kill Americans here at home and around the world. We should be careful when we get involved. Foreign aid is not a one-way street and should always be conditioned and based on our national interest. Military power should be employed judiciously and only where it can make a difference in defending our long-term goals. But we cannot pretend that if we ignore our enemies, they will ignore us. We must be involved. And when we get involved, we must make sure not just that we're doing it the right way, we must make sure that we are doing it at the right time. Because sometimes acting too late is worse than not acting at all. And when we do get involved, it's okay to be motivated by humanitarian concerns. But the primary objective of our foreign policy must always be to protect our people from those who do or may one day want to harm us. This is the kind of clear strategic view of America's role and of our interests that should guide our foreign policy. It is the kind of clear strategic thinking that this president has failed to lay out. And as a result, what we see all around us is failure. The president dithered on Syria. We should have tried to identify secular rebels early in the conflict, and we should have made sure that they were the best armed and the best trained group on the ground. But instead, the president decided to lead from behind and allow others to decide who to arm. And the result is that today, it is rebel groups linked to al-Qaeda, foreign fighters, not even Syrians, who are the best armed and best equipped groups within Syria. And now I fear that Syria may be headed towards becoming like Afghanistan before 9/11, towards becoming the premier operational area in the world for global jihadists. The president entered office with the naive belief that we could convince Iran to become a responsible nation by, quite frankly, simply being nicer to them. He wasted valuable early years in his presidency, not giving the Iranian threat priority. And now the Ayatollahs continue the march towards acquiring both nuclear weapons and long-range missiles that could one day threaten the United States. And I would be remiss if I did not point out that in 2009, he missed an opportunity to clearly stand on the side of those protesting a stolen election, and instead chose not to because he didn't want to interfere in the quote-unquote sovereignty of another nation. The president also wasted time thinking that the cause of radical Islamic terrorism was partially because George W. Bush was hated in the Muslim world. But despite his speech in Cairo, despite his efforts to close Guantanamo, despite his elimination of the use and the term war on terror, al-Qaeda continues to hate America. And even as I speak to you here today, they continue to plan attacks against America, here and around the world. The president's not alone in failing to confront these threats. I'm afraid that because of the success we've had in preventing another attack on the scale of 9/11, some of our leaders in both parties have been lulled into a sense of false security. I certainly support the privacy rights and expectations of all Americans. But my colleagues, I also know for a fact that the surveillance programs that our governments use have prevented attacks and saved American lives. Now, I think it's a mistake to dismiss privacy concerns as crazy. After all, we have a government whose tax collecting agency has targeted Americans because of their political views. But it's also a mistake to exaggerate them. After all, if a known terrorist is emailing or calling someone in the United States, we better be able to know who and where that person is. If Osama bin Laden had been calling someone in the United States on their cell phone, I promise you it wasn't his stockbroker. We better know, because these people are still plotting against us. And not if, but when they strike again, the American people are going to turn to us and ask us, what has the federal government been doing to prevent this? We better have a good answer. Because we live in a very dangerous world. One, by the way, where our enemies aren't just other countries anymore. Our enemies are rogue states and their well-armed militias and radical clerics. And this kind of danger calls for a clear strategic vision on foreign policy. And this president sadly does not have one. Which brings me to my third and primary concern about Ms. Powers' nomination. And it's one that's related to the United Nations itself. We need an advocate in New York who makes it their primary focus to ensure that the United Nations is more accountable, that it is more effective, and that it serves U.S. interests, and that it is not just some multilateral ideal in which we invest all of our hopes. Now, if she's confirmed today, I hope that Ms. Power does indeed become that type of ambassador. But I have not been satisfied by the evidence thus far of this administration's willingness to be serious about tackling these issues over the last 4.5 years that ensure that every American dollar going to the UN actually advances America's interests. And I think that Congress needs to play a more active role in forcing this very much-needed change to occur. So what I'd like to do here in closing is spend a few minutes highlighting legislation that I recently introduced to this effect. And I'm pleased to have as co-sponsors Senator Cornyn, Senator Risch, Senator Flake, and I hope more of my colleagues will join this effort. I'm not the first person to raise concerns about the effectiveness and the utility of the United Nations. Former Senator John Danforth, who was serving as our ambassador to the UN in 2004, when the UN General Assembly couldn't even pass a resolution condemning human rights violence and violations in Sudan, said at the time, quote, "One wonders about the utility of the General Assembly on days like this. One wonders if there can't be a clear and direct statement. One wonders if there can't be a clear and direct statement on matters of basic principle. Why have this building? What is it all about?" Unquote. And anyone who has followed the UN closely, especially in recent years, as the Security Council has failed to respond to the crisis in Syria, as more than 100,000 Syrians have died and hundreds of thousands more have been forced out of their homes across borders, straining all of Syria's neighbors, leaving behind a failing state that is about to become a safe haven for global jihadists. All of people who share these concerns and have seen this happen, they should be rightly asking the same question that Senator Danforth asked back then. In the midst of this horrific crisis, the UN has even been unable to achieve consensus on the issue of whether to allow international humanitarian organizations to provide cross-border support to tens of thousands of Syrians stuck in camps, facing frequent shelling and attacks from the Assad regime. And just as we're troubled by this inability to tackle the world's toughest problems, we should also be angry about the fact that for decades, more human rights criticism at the UN has been directed against Israel than against actual human rights violators and the UN agencies and organizations that have employed blatant anti-Semites. Or that for decades, recipients of UN foreign aid have only voted with the United States at the UN less than 1/3 of the time. And such support, by the way, doesn't even currently factor into U.S. decisions about who receives our foreign aid. Or the fact that the world's most notorious tyrants and human rights violators are allowed to serve on the Human Rights Commission or Human Rights Council rather than being condemned by it. Or by the fraud and the mismanagement that has pervaded the UN's peacekeeping operations, including abuses and exploitation of the very people that those peacekeepers were sent to protect. Or by the Security Council resolutions on Iran and North Korea that members of the UN willfully violate, as we recently saw with the Panamanian capture of a ship transferring weapons from Cuba, one rogue state, to North Korea, another one. Or by the proliferation of mandates that have clouded the organization's mission and its effectiveness. The list goes on and on. But let me be clear. I'm not here today to argue that we don't need the United Nations. Ideally, we would have a United Nations where the nations of the world would come together and seriously deal with North Korea and Iran and radical Islam and human rights. But the UN we have right now isn't capable of any of this. It's basically become a forum for nations whose interests are directly opposed to ours to block our efforts and use the United Nations as cover. That's how North Korea and Iran continue to evade sanctions. That's how Israel's enemies continue their efforts to delegitimize the Jewish state. That's how Assad continues to massacre his own people with weapons built in and supplied by the Russians. More than 6 decades after its creation, we still hope for a UN with resolve, a UN that acts with effectiveness and purpose. Sadly, the UN's persistent ethics and accountability problems are limiting its role. And until the organization addresses these important issues, it will continue to be ineffective and often irrelevant. Americans should care about this more than any other people because we shoulder the primary fiscal burden of the UN's budget, and our patience is not limitless. We don't believe in continuing to throw money at programs and projects that fail to accomplish their objectives. So my hope with the legislation that I filed is to provide an incentive for the United Nations and the President and our ambassador in New York to modernize the international body along a spirit of transparency, respect for basic human freedoms, and effective nonproliferation. This legislation would also attempt to address the anti-Semitic attitudes that have become so prevalent in certain corners of the UN and seriously diminish the effectiveness and the credibility of the entire United Nations system. At the core of these reforms that I've proposed is an effort to instill a sense of transparency and competition at the UN by its adoption of a budgetary model that relies mostly on voluntary contributions. The legislation would also strengthen the international standing of human rights by reforming the UN Human Rights Council in a way that it would deny membership to nations under UN sanctions, designated by our Department of State as state sponsors of terrorism, or failing to take measures to combat and end the despicable practice of human trafficking. Other provisions of the bill seek meaningful reforms at the UN Relief and Work Agency that provides assistance to Palestinian refugees of the 1948 Arab-Israeli conflict. This legislation is needed because the structure and bureaucratic culture of the organization often makes it impossible, or at best downright difficult, to achieve meaningful reforms. In closing, for more than 6 decades now, the United Nations has served as an important multilateral forum to address peace and security issues throughout the world. But it has never been, and it is not now, a substitute for strong American leadership. When America fails to lead, the world becomes more dangerous. The United Nations is badly broken, and I hope we will work to force meaningful transparency and accountability reform for the UN. But so far, this administration does not seem very interested in doing so. And unfortunately, at least based on our conversations, neither does the nominee before us. And therefore, until we begin to take some positive steps in that direction, I will not be able to support Obama administration nominees who have not committed to significant reform at the UN. Ms. Power has failed to make such a commitment, and therefore that is why I am voting today against her nomination to be our next ambassador to the United Nations.